Hey everybody, welcome to Ask the Pastor. I am Matt Love, and I'm not actually technically here with J.D. Greear because we are doing a gospel and politics series for the last few weeks. J.D.'s been having these conversations with different leaders and thinkers and just processing some of these big topics that are really coming up as we enter into this political season. So this week we're continuing that series with a special guest who is actually a member of the Summit Church, Brooke Medina. Brooke, like I said, attends Summit, is a member of Summit, serves as the Vice President of Communications for the John Locke Foundation. She has been published in numerous outlets, and JD's going to share a little bit more about that in just a minute. But basically, she knows a lot about economic philosophy. So, cool topic, cool person. This entire series has been really helpful and has brought up a lot of helpful things for a lot of people. So I hope that you are able to engage and just enjoy this conversation with Brooke. Let's kick it over to JD.
I am delighted to talk with my friend and a person who lives here in Raleigh, member of the Summit Church, Brooke Medina. We are appropriately dressed in red, white, and blue. So we are a nice little flag up here to talk about economics in America. Brooke is the Vice President of Communications for the John Locke Foundation, where she oversees their strategic communications, marketing efforts. She engages with the press and the public. She manages a team of communications, design. So she's very involved at all levels. She's a graduate of Regent University, where she got a major in government and a minor in English. Brooke's writing has been published in outlets such as The Hill, Entrepreneur, Washington Examiner, and World Magazine. And so it's always a delight when I'm reading it. I'm like, oh, I know the person that wrote that. It's Brooke Medina. She also contributed to a book that I own, edited by Jason Thacker, who's been also a guest in this interview series. It's titled The Digital Public Square. We actually had him on, talked about it, thinking about Christian ethics in a technological society. So again, Brooke and her family have been a part of the Summit for a long time. And so I wanted to make sure that we had her in this conversation because she has a lot that she daily will think about applying the Christian worldview, specifically, not only in, but specifically with economics is what we want to talk about. So we're going to talk about economic philosophy, and that is obviously not as cut and dry for the Christian as things like abortion and definition of marriage and that sort of thing. General question, how should a Christian think about economics? How do we approach it?
Yeah, well, a general question, but a really important one. And I think something that often is not covered in economics when we take it in college or even in high school is the fact that economics at its core is the study of human action, what people do with their lives, what they do with their wealth, what they do with their capital. And so when we start to think of it like that, it's just a lot easier for those folks of us like myself who have a liberal arts degree and didn't major in math and science, but also understanding that at the core of economics is this study of anthropology, who man is. And so I think something that is especially important and useful for Christians to think about when they consider economics is what is man's purpose? Who is man? Well, we know he's created in the image of God. He has inherent dignity and worth. And so understanding economics through a Christian lens means understanding that economics matter because people matter, and people matter because they're created in the image of God. And so I think that's a really important part of economics that often gets lost in the conversations of the day when it comes to politics and we're talking about the marginal tax rate or the GDP or tariffs or anything like that. But at the root of it all has to do with who is man? What decisions is he making or she making?
What's he capable of making?
Yeah. And so I think that's how Christians should first and foremost approach economics, is considering the fact that it reflects our Creator and it allows us to be creative, free individuals and agents in a society and engage in actions with other people in hopefully a free and ordered society.
Yeah, so my economics professor in college was named Dr. Sin, literally spelled S-I-N. And that name was not from, not a typical American name. But I always thought that was a little bit of a metaphor for kind of how people think about it. It was like, oh, it's kind of, you make money, and Christians are like, I don't know if there's what's the Christian interest in there? But, it's like you're saying, everything that we do in the world, kind of right now, there's a lot of interaction with money. A lot of corruption comes out of money. A lot of life-giving things comes out of freedom. It requires an economic component. So, let me press the question down just a little bit farther and say, what is it that Christians should agree? What do we have to agree on when it comes to thinking about economic questions? Because let's just, be honest. We got some today in our society that would say, hey, I'm attracted to the more socialist position. I think capitalism is terrible and just leads to injustice. Other people are like, no, it's free market all the way. So what do Christians have to agree on? And then where can we allow room for disagreement?
So I think the way Christians need to find places of agreement is those areas that are really clearly laid out in Scripture, or that there are very clear biblical examples of a well-ordered society in Scripture. Something you've mentioned from the pulpit before is that Scripture presupposes the existence of private property ownership, for example. And so I think that's an essential element that Christians, regardless of which political party you lean toward, need to find agreement on, is that people should have the ability to exert control over or an ownership over property. Doesn't mean they're always going to do it correctly. Doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a rule of law governing how they engage in contracts. But I think Scripture presupposes that mankind does best with private property ownership so that there isn't a tragedy of the commons, so that people are actually able to exert creative agency and promote human flourishing within their individual God-gifted vocations.
Define that term, tragedy of commons. I heard you throw that out. So
Yeah,
not that I don't understand, but just for everyone else.
Yeah, so tragedy of the commons is oftentimes when you see certain public areas where no one is responsible, or for example, maybe you had a group project, and so all of us can identify with this, where maybe you received a group project assignment and there's only one or two hard workers in that group of 5 or 6. And so what happens oftentimes is that a few people are pulling the weight and others are sort of freeloading. And so that is a tragedy of the commons when something is held in common rather than there being individual responsibilities delegated to folks or people volunteering.
And so what I'm hearing you say is that's rooted in this idea that God, He created us for work, and He created us to have some type of ownership and connection to our work, right? Like, God put man in the garden to keep it, to develop it. And so, knowing that, like, yes, this is not mine in the sense that it's not God's, but it's something that He's given me stewardship over. And so how would
and
you?
It's an act of worship, I think, too. And I think that's a part of this, that when we deprive people of the opportunity to work, the opportunity to invest as they see fit for the causes that they believe in, and we maybe tax them far too much and put too much onus on the government, that deprives people of that opportunity or the resources they need to be able to exert dominion in the sphere that God has given them. You mentioned Abraham Kuyper earlier, and he talks about sphere sovereignty and these different arenas that God has called Christians to. And there is a beauty in that. And I think that oftentimes if we centralize things too much and we put too much onus on elected officials, perhaps, or bureaucrats, it does deprive people in their own communities of being that man on the ground, able to speak to and exercise culture care over the folks that are in their lives.
What would you say to, this is out of left field, what would you say to the person who's reading the Bible and they get to Acts 2 and they're like, look, they had all things in common and it'd just be so much better instead of rich people getting rich, and some people, it's not right. This one guy has 5 jets and another guy, can't seem to afford the rent this month and doesn't have a livable wage, and we should just put all things in common and let somebody distribute it. And that seems to be what they do in Acts 2. What would your...
Yeah, well, that is a principle that even some Christian theologians over the years have supported, called distributism. I think you and I have spoken about this before, where there are some folks that believe there is some play between socialism and capitalism that this distributist concept can operate in. But I would say history is an excellent teacher when it comes to figuring out which economic theories actually panned out well. And we think about even the Pilgrims, perhaps, at the very beginning, and they held all things in common when they first came here. And it just didn't last very long. It was not a sustainable economic system, especially at large scale, in a country as big as ours, in a global system as big as ours. So it sounds ideal in many ways, and I am very much one who loves to read sort of about romanticized ideals of political theories actually working out. But as we well know, oftentimes utopias turn into dystopias when they're put into practice. And I think that's one of them. And also another part of that in Acts, it was that they voluntarily held all things in common. And oftentimes what ends up having to happen for us to hold all things in common as a society, especially a very pluralistic society like the United States, is that it has to happen by force of government. The guys with the guns have to be able to enforce that for that to actually be a thing, because not everybody wants to hold all things in common. Something I've told my kids before, I've given them this example, is let's say we wiped all the debts clean in one day and we allocated everybody the same exact amount of resources and we just basically hit the big reset button. Despite the fact that maybe you and I both had $100,000, as did everyone else in Raleigh-Durham. By the end of that day, maybe even by the end of that hour that had happened, we would have disparities, wealth disparities, because people use their wealth, they use their money in different ways as they see fit. So nothing will ever be even in that respect. And I think that we, as Christians especially, we look to a greater kingdom. We look to Christ rule and reign on this earth, and we need to be his hands and feet on the earth in this present time. But we have to be careful that we don't try to look for cosmic justice on the here and now in ways that we can't, because it doesn't align with human behavior.
Yeah. So if we're talking about things Christians have to agree on, and I feel like you've thrown some out there that are excellent examples. We have, just the dignity of work, the responsibility of work. Paul says in the New Testament, if a man doesn't work, he shouldn't eat. Just the human psychology of how God created us with what ownership does. There's a lot of those principles. We would also obviously add in there care for the poor. It's responsible of those of us who have been prospered to take care of those who aren't, rather than just criticize them or say, well, if they work hard. So if we agree on those things, where do you see room for disagreement? Because and I've said this before, I don't know anywhere that you could agree with all those principles, and I don't know if that necessitates and therefore the marginal tax rate should be this, and this is when we go from a healthy safety net, social safety net, to being a welfare state that discourages work. How do you think about where Christians can disagree?
Yeah, I think that, what you're saying about as long as we can't agree on the inherent dignity and worth of individuals, there's going to be a lot of play based on economists' trends, that their projections that they're making, what the Fed is doing, what's happening at local and state level, where there is going to be plenty of room for disagreement, because every state in and of itself is a test lab for liberty. And so there are going to be different solutions for different states. For example, what works in North Carolina isn't necessarily going to be able to be replicated in a state with a vastly different economy. And so I think that it's important, even when we're talking about disagreement, that to understand that states and nations are going to just have their own solutions. But so some things I think we need a little bit more robust discussion around is stuff like, do we subsidize housing? And I think there's some good cases for it. I think there's some terrible cases for it, and there's some problems when it comes to how much money we allocate to education in the United States versus giving parents maybe more school choice and giving them the funds for the education rather than the public school system. So I think where there's a lot of room for disagreement and healthy, robust debate is how we actually allocate the economic resources that we give the state. And I think that we are made better by good debate when it comes to education and healthcare policy, which all flow from how much revenue the government brings in, which comes from economic policy.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting, even historically. I'll read some of my old Puritan friends and, evangelicals in Great Britain in the 1800s. And, dealing with some of the social dynamics they were dealing with. I don't know if you call it unrestrained capitalism, but it was sort of a new, all these new dynamics. And you find a lot of the guys, men and women that would share the same principles that we would about man, because of their historical situation, they tended to be arguing more on the safety net side. Like, hey, this is what is required just in a society. And I've often put myself there and thought, okay, if I were alive in that time holding these principles, would I have been one that was kind of more on the, and I don't know. I mean, you can certainly also say that some of what they instituted maybe, had longer, like it turned out poorly in the long run because they didn't think carefully about, all the reforms they were instituting. But I do think that there's an awareness that these principles have a situation you apply them in, and sometimes just difference of judgment. So that leads me to my next. Go ahead. What are you
I was just going to mention, though, I think that is a really good example because each generation walks in the light that they have. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, what does work in certain times and spaces, because in that case, probably a response to the Industrial Revolution, for example, there's great disruption. Some say that we are in a fourth Industrial Revolution right now. And so there is wide disagreement among Christians as well as to how do we prepare people for this AI revolution. Mm-hmm. It's going to displace people or it's going to upend jobs. And so I think the solutions to that are going to be varied, and there is going to be good debate around it. But at the end of the day, we have to remember that ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims. And so we need to be very, very careful.
I'm adding that to next time I say that.
Yeah, just quote me. But I stole it from someone else.
There you go. That's right. Originality is the ability to forget where you got it from. So that's the key to all of my originality. So let me go down this trail just a little bit farther. So I always say that as a pastor, I have to limit myself to what the Bible is clear about. Sometimes I use this. In fact, I used it recently. I call it straight line and dotted line, direct line. If there's a straight, direct line from what the Bible says and a policy, then I'll make the connection. It's wrong to be a Nazi. I feel like you can say that pretty. It's wrong. Racism, institutionalized racism is wrong. Pro-choice, things that endanger the lives of the vulnerable. Those things are wrong. Where there's what I would call a dotted line, meaning I got Christian wisdom. I think it's shaping how I approach this, that I feel like as a pastor, I need to kind of like say, I want to restrain myself because I realize different Christians could apply these things in different ways. You are not in the same category because you actually work in the space.
I am a Christian, though.
You are a Christian. That's right. You are not the same category. No. Yeah. And we go to the same church, but you are in a space where you kind of have to think about even some of the finer details. So give us an example. And I'll just say, this is not an example of you declaring a policy for all Christians everywhere in the Summit Church. But can you think of some examples where you would take what you look at as Christian wisdom, biblical principles, and how you would think about an economic issue, even with the caveat that somebody in your small group may see it differently, and that's okay. This is not an issue that would split the two of you. So
yeah. One of them I would say, bringing up the welfare issue again, when you mentioned the Puritans operating with that system. But in the United States, if you lean right, sometimes you call it the welfare state and, have sort of some derision for it. And then on the left, it's, it's making sure that there is a safety net.
It's a handout, not a handout.
Yeah. And, I think one of the policies in particular that I would encourage my fellow churchgoers to consider is when it comes to the welfare cliff. I think that's a huge problem that we have. So many conservatives, such as myself, we would prefer the government get out of the way of subsidizing so much and because it does sometimes serve as a disincentive for work. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, though, when people start to begin to earn more income, let's say they're coming from a very, very low income place and they're starting to rise at their job and getting better pay, they approach what's called the welfare cliff. And so that cliff is something where it makes more sense for them to stay on government programs than it does for them to get that pay raise and qualify out of those government programs. And so they have reached this cliff and now they're in a worse state financially.
Because they're going to give up a subsidy.
Because they're giving up, maybe it's healthcare, maybe it's food stamps.
So it's better for them economically, just not work.
Yes. And so it is a poorly structured program by the government in an attempt to help. I think in many ways, it is well-intentioned, but it is an attempt to help, and yet it harms people from actually being able to rise out of that level of poverty or just financial restraint that they've been facing. Mm-hmm. And so I think that is one of those perverse incentives that the government has. And sometimes I see progressives lean more toward just expanding welfare than to continue to reach new income tiers. And I would say, I think we need to look more creatively at the welfare programs we have and create things like a one-door policy where if someone is trying to get out of reliance upon government programs, they go to one location with one particular government program and they help them chart a path forward so that they can become a member of society that doesn't feel like they're beholden constantly to government programs. People want that. I've spent many years over the past couple of decades working with folks who are in poverty, spent time with the homeless, seeing what folks in food pantries are in dire straits in many ways. They don't want to be in those positions. And so I think looking at government programs that really bring and restore that dignity that these people inherently have and bring it to the government programs themselves, rather than just having a plan for them to stay on these programs for the rest of their lives, help them out of it and make it a little bit easier once they actually do start to rise.
Now, I'm guessing if I were to ask you specific bills, specific candidates at all levels, local, state, national, you could probably give me a rundown of who was on what side of those questions. And I'm not going to ask you to do that. But I know that you would work in those, and I could probably do a little Google research, figure it out. And there are people that would share the same values, and they may say, well, I actually feel like that, that cliff is a little bit farther, or I feel like it's, there's a little bit more subsidy, and you may disagree with them, but we could say, hey, I think the key here is we should be thinking biblically and then allowing each other freedom to do that. I mean, at least that's what I want to do as a church. Is that?
Yeah. St. Augustine is credited with this. I don't know if he actually was the one that said it, but
he gets credited with a lot. Him, C.S. Lewis, and Charles Spurgeon.
I hate the C.S. Lewis misquotes, but I don't know as much about St. Augustine, so I'm going to do it this time.
Perfect, good.
But he said, in the essentials, unity, in the non-essentials, liberty, and in all things, charity. And I think that is really constructive for believers, especially in political years, though, when the tensions seem to be rising. And I would say there are a lot of second level issues when it comes to politics. There are some first order issues. You've mentioned them before, the right to life, the sanctity of marriage. But there are some second level ones, and I think we should make sure that we're exerting charity towards one another and just listening.
Yeah, what a great thing to almost end on, because I got one more question. But whether or not Augustine said it, in essentials, biblical truths, unity, non-essentials, liberty, and all things, charity. Let me ask one more question just to kind of wrap us up, just because I know you've written a lot about this, and it's the relationship of free speech and some of these economic questions. So I'm not going to put much more to it than that, but talk about that for a moment, because I know you've written so much about this and it's been helpful. I'd love to hear you talk about it for a minute.
Yeah. So there's a lot of discussion these days about big tech and the role of censorship on social media. And we see political lines drawn in this respect, where there are some folks that say that social media companies are censoring conservatives. And then on the left, we see, social media companies need to censor against hate speech. And so the public square and the conversation of what is free speech versus what are private companies' rights to operate, business practices, they're becoming starker and starker. And so one of the areas of research that I've undergone is just what exactly does it mean to be free in a digital age? And what does speech look like in a digital age? And what rights do companies have, including social media companies, to issue their own policies and actually make their users stick to it? And so I think that this is one of those new battlegrounds, but I would say we should be relying on old principles and just apply them to this new digital public square. And oftentimes I've given the example, I don't want my church to be required to host any type of speech that someone else wants to say just because it's free speech. Free speech is meant for us as citizens to be protected against the government punishing us for the speech we say. It doesn't mean that you as a private actor have to put up with my speech in your home or in your business. And so I think that approaching the digital public square with that sort of mindset where we respect individuals to be able to have their own opinions and we give them a place to do so, but also that we respect the businesses who are operating not in brick and mortar spaces, but through the internet, the ability to exert ownership over their own property, their digital property. And so this is one of those issues that is certainly coming to a boil, and it will, especially in an election year like this. And I think for the Christian, though, even though the social media companies and legislatures all across the country are having these battles about whether or not social media companies should be allowed to censor, Christians, though, we need to be there in these spaces, whether it's on X, formerly known as Twitter, or Facebook, or Instagram, or TikTok. We need to be there speaking truth and speaking with grace, though. And I think that is something that, as believers, it is a new mission field. It's a digital mission field, but it's an area that we need to be at, regardless of what people are saying, their political opinions are, who they're trying to shut down. I think we need to be a witness and a presence there.
Well, let me thank you for actually choosing to be in those spaces. One of the things I feel like we don't do enough, so I'll say it to you, kind of saying it to everybody. For those of you that are brave enough, bold enough to step into what is a very secular environment and often very unfriendly to that. I mean, in some sense, my job is easy because I work with people that share my convictions, but you stepped into that. And so I feel like sometimes we are a little so scared of how to navigate that we kind of leave you guys isolated out there and don't say that you're sent to that, just like, some of our missionaries are sent overseas. So thank you for what you do. Thank you for all of you guys, what you do in that. I have prayed for years that at least one Supreme Court justice will come out of this church. So I don't know. Maybe it's you. Would you like to be a Supreme Court justice?
No, thank you.
Okay, well,
I'll pray for you too, though.
maybe they're in the student ministry right now. But anyway, we would, our vision is that, we as a church are not partisan, and we try to stay out of the weeds of some things that are the applications of Christian wisdom. We also want to see a generation of people that rise up to go into all spheres, and that certainly includes the political spheres, because that's maybe where we need salt and light the most. So, Brooke Medina, ladies and gentlemen, I know that you're giving a standing ovation there wherever you're listening to this, but thank you, Brooke.
All right, well, I hope that was helpful. Next week, we're going to hear an interview from another member of the Summit Church. We're doing the Summit Church membership stretch. It's like a mini-series within the series, and we're going to be hearing from Neil Shinvey. So go ahead and subscribe if you don't want to miss any of these episodes. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all that good stuff. Don't miss an episode. Also, we are on YouTube, so go ahead and subscribe there, J.D. Greear, and we'll see you next time on Ask the Pastor.